Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today is the 4th of July, 2024. It is the day the United States of America celebrates its independence from Great Britain, often conceptualizing this as freedom from the tyrannical rule of a foreign country. This is, of course, nonsense, because America was not a nation that was held in bondage to another nation, but was rather part of the British Empire. So the American Revolution was really a secessionist movement rather than one that freed one country from another. The United States of America did not actually exist until after the Revolution, although of course its existence was declared during the Revolution, specifically on the 2nd day of July, 1776, with the Declaration of Independence, which was stamped the 4th of July for when it was printed and received in Congress, and that is the day that we generally associate with independence. It also happens to be my birthday, a day in which I turn another year older and we celebrate the grandeur of my life. A life which, for the last 5 or 6 years, has been rather a devastating ruin, but hopefully one to which I have been, improving upon. This year is also a presidential election, one in which the first debate has already been held. Unusually, it was held between two people who are not actually candidates. That, of course, sounds odd, but you have to realize that candidates are not officially picked until the conventions, and neither the Democrat convention nor the Republican convention has actually been held. So, strictly speaking, and on a technical level, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, while understood as the presumptive candidates, are not yet certified as the actual candidates for their respective parties. Meaning this was a debate between prospective candidates rather than actual candidates. They are, of course, more than just prospective, they are presumptive, which means that we presume they will be ratified since they have won the selection within a general election, at least ostentatiously. If that were, however, the only unusual thing, that would simply be an interesting footnote, but it isn't the only interesting thing. There is a third major candidate who is known and who would otherwise have a chance, but the media wants to ignore him. In fact, this third candidate is the only one who is actually a candidate and was actually a candidate at the time of the debate. And that would be Kennedy. The Kennedy ticket is independent and did not rely on a convention and is already certified with the Election Commission because it certified itself. That's how an independent candidate would work. So, out of the 3 prospective presidential candidates, only one of them is an actual candidate, and he was the one that was excluded from the debate. A debate which played out rather like a farce, where the candidates insulted each other, jibed each other, and constantly took offense at each other, answering not so much the question put before them, but addressing statements made under the previous question by their opponent, and ultimately boiling down to who had the best golf game. However, even though the debate was a shameful disgrace, Joe Biden has been demonstrated to most Americans to be feeble-minded and suffering mental decline, and most are not convinced he should run the country, with most believing that the debate was not simply won by Donald Trump, but overwhelmingly won by Donald Trump, even those who oppose him. This particular debate may very well live in infamy and has made world news. On top of that, President Trump has been president before. Most people think if he wins a second term, he is limited to that one last term, since the Constitution says one may only have 2 terms. This is actually incorrect. The Constitution says you can only have 2 consecutive terms. So theoretically, someone could run for president, get elected, win a second term, leave office for 1 term, and then come back and have a 3rd term so long as it is interrupted. Nevertheless, most people have it in their heads that you can only have 2 terms. Which, of course, still brings us back to the fact that Donald Trump has already been president, and should he win, he would be the 2nd president of the United States to serve non-consecutive terms. He is a contentious figure that many think of as a criminal, and in fact he is currently a convicted felon on charges that others would see as trumped up, and even though I don't like to get too political, they do seem to be trumped up. Which is very odd because the people who are his political rivals are very clearly trying to use the legal system against him, whilst claiming he is a dangerous threat to democracy because if he gets in, he'll be another Charlie Chaplin from the movie The Dictator, and he would go after his political rivals using the legal system, and that this must never happen, even though it does. He also won broad immunity for his official acts as president, which is being spun by his opponents as broad immunity in all matters, and now they say the president is lawless and is a law unto himself, and, of course, the favorite of Americans, the president is now a king above the law, because kings apparently don't have to obey the law. Being a monarchist, I really resent that, since kings can be placed under the law. A monarchy is not necessarily a dictatorship, nor is it a choice between a dictatorship or a powerless figurehead. But that is the world. We also live in a world where entertainment has largely begun cannibalizing its past successes, without coming up with very much that is new, and generally simply reviving old established properties and trying to repackage them because they were successful, yet at the same time, the people running them now do not truly understand those particular stories and what made them popular. And, weirdly, for whatever reason, they have decided to pack their stories with modern-day political messaging overlaid on stories that they don't understand and worlds they don't understand, whilst attacking the fans who don't like this as racialists and sexists and homophobists. And I'm sorry for the euphemism, but on the tube of you, I cannot speak freely. My channel is monitored for that reason, because I am seen as being on the starboard side, and our dear hosts here tend to be port side, and they don't like what I say, even though I am not a deeply political person, and very rarely venture into those sorts of topics. Nevertheless, my channel is one of those that, if I speak angrily, like an opponent of mine would, in terms of theology, I seem to get better circulation. I don't like talking that way, but that is the way it is. And I largely work without scripts, by the way. So we live in a world where the Walt Disney Company, as well as Paramount, which, by the way, might be sold to another company and which is selling off assets now, and Warner Brothers and all the other major studios in Hollywood have brought back Star Wars, as well as Indiana Jones and Willow from Lucasfilm. They've brought back Star Trek in the last few years. They've brought back the world of Middle-earth from Tolkien. They've brought back, well, even He-Man from the 1980s, and She-Ra. And yet, they have a tendency of changing them to reflect their modern values in Hollywood, while at the same time not trying to even weave them into a creative story. I actually think the woke politics are bad to add to the stories myself. But I actually think that the woke politics are not the most important flaw to the stories. The most important flaw is the bad writing, because most people seem to think Andor is well written, and some even say it's not woke, but it is woke, because woke is a term we use for neo-Marxism and the political left, which embraces neo-Marxism and the progressivist values of neo-Marxism, as well as postmodernism and the deconstruction of Gerada, which was a communist method, which is odd because the self-declared skeptic community, the atheist community, keeps claiming that it's wrong to call them communists, while nowadays praising deconstruction and deconstruction of your faith when deconstruction was created by communists to foment revolution. They also never subject their own beliefs as atheists to deconstruction, because atheism is not a belief, atheism is a lack of belief. Specifically, atheism is not a belief that a God does not exist, it is a lack of belief in a God. This is why atheists don't have a burden of proof, because they're not claiming that God doesn't exist, they lack belief. And of course we all know that's a lie. Atheists actually do claim God does not exist, they just don't admit that they do, and hide behind a fake definition, defining the word atheist as a lack of belief in a God, or one who lacks belief in a God, gets them out of the burden of proof, no matter what they say. They also ignore the fact that modern atheists very obviously equate being an atheist with believing in science, being a rationalist, being a freethinker, and several other specific beliefs, such as that religion is an inherently dangerous and intolerant thing, that religion creates tribalism, that religious people have in-group, out-group preferences, and that atheists, of course, are immune from all of that because they have no religion. They don't subject those beliefs to deconstruction because atheism is a mere lack of belief in a God, even though these beliefs are not a lack of belief in a God, but are protected by that definition. The moment you try and criticize their beliefs, atheism is a lack of belief in a God, and there's nothing there to criticize. Of course, you can deconstruct their beliefs even if they won't, and you can apply deconstruction to anything. You can even apply deconstruction to Marxism. Deconstruction does not get you to the truth, it just gives you an excuse to reject something, which really, in the long run, doesn't help if you actually did apply it to everything, which is why it has always been selectively applied only to the things they want to destroy. We also live in a world where Pope Francis has been causing a stir in the Catholic Church, now with his controversies, which are very difficult to explain, and I shan't go into the detail here, because on the one hand, what he actually does is bad, but on the other hand, the media reports it as good, but then misrepresents it. For example, they talk about Pope Francis allowing for the blessings of same-sex couples, meaning that apparently the Church no longer views homosexuality as a sin. This is not true, though. The Church is not approving of same-sex relationships. If you actually read what was said, it allows individual priests, so long as there is no ceremony involved, to bless individual people, even if engaged in same-sex relations, or to bless two people who are engaged in that sort of relationship without giving sanction to the relationship. It is still problematic because it turns into a de facto blessing for a same-sex wedding, even if it's not, but it is not an actual blessing of same-sex relationships. But you see, that's sort of the problem with Pope Francis. He's created a very confusing mess, and he does this quite often. And he doesn't really like traditionalists either. He does not like traditional Catholics, and he is trying to abolish the traditional Latin Mass, which, for those who don't know, the traditional Latin Mass is not simply the Mass that we have now in Latin. The Novus Ordo Massae, the Mass that you generally attend, that is spoken in the vernacular, is not the same as the traditional Latin Mass, only in the vernacular. A lot of people seem to think that the only difference is they translated it into the vernacular, and traditionalists hate that and want Latin. In reality, there are several key differences between the Tridentine Mass and the Novus Ordo Massae. I shan't go into all the differences there either because, well, I need to keep this video at some reasonable length. But one of the key differences is that in the Novus Ordo Mass, the priest faces the people. But in the Tridentine Mass, the priest faces away from the people toward the altar. Some people may think that's not a major difference, but it is. You see, in the traditional Mass, he faced away from the people to the altar because he is leading the people to God. He is facing God. He is facing the altar, on which we have the representation of Christ. And by the way, representation here goes back to the original use of the word representation. It does not mean this is something that is not Jesus, but it is a symbol that represents him. It's something that we put here instead of Jesus to speak for him. That is not what representation means. A representation is not something that is not Jesus, but that we use in place of Jesus. Represent literally means to present again. That's what means. It means again, and present means to present. So, when dealing with the Mass, when we talk about Jesus being represented on the altar, we do not mean that something is standing in for him. We would mean that on the altar is Jesus made present again at the consecration. And of course, in Catholicism and in Christianity in general, Jesus is God. That is why that difference is a major and important one, because one of them has the priest understood as a shepherd leading his flock to God, whilst the other, the one where the priest faces the people, sees him as a people's representative answerable to them. And there are other differences in the Novus Ordo Mass as well. I just can't go into them whilst having this video at a reasonable length, but I just need people to understand that the traditional Latin Mass is not simply the Mass in Latin as opposed to the Mass in the vernacular. They didn't just translate the Mass into vernacular languages. There are key changes. And all of this, of course, happened in the 1960s at Vatican II, but a consistent core of traditionalists have held on to the traditional Mass as well as traditional beliefs and practices, and those have seen a resurgence in recent years, and the late Pope Benedict XVI actually expanded the ability to use the Tridentine Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, as they would be called. As such, it saw a large influx of people going to it. Pope Francis, who fancies himself a reformer, does not like this increased revived interest in the traditional Mass, so he wishes to effectively abolish it. He is not going so far as to outright ban it everywhere. Certain things whose charism is to preserve the traditional Latin Mass, like the Fraternal Saintly Order of St. Peter, the Society, Pius X, Sacred. I'm sorry, I'm using euphemisms because the two of you does not like me mentioning certain things, but here's the thing. There are certain groups within the Catholic Church that will continue to be allowed to use the Latin Mass because it is part of their charism, but they will be restricted and limited so that the Pope can make it go away, make it the least common of them. And he wishes to push other reforms as well, perhaps allowing women to be non-ordained deacons. Of course, people in today's world who don't know much about the church will just see them as deacons, and they'll see them as ordained, and they'll see it as a step for full ordination, which of course is framed as an issue of equality, because the theological issues are set aside, precisely because of that priest facing the people being their representative. People don't want to understand why there's an all-male clergy in the Catholic Church. They just claim it's sexist, and that it means that they are not properly represented, and other things like that. This is the year 2024. This is my new year, because it is my birthday. This is the world I live in. I live in a world where the Anglican Communion is falling apart, and there are now more people attending breakaway forms of Anglicanism not in communion with Canterbury than are attending those that are. Even in Britain, there are more people attending the Free Church of England than the Church of England. And the Church of England continues to go in a direction that echoes other churches, like the Methodist Church, with its recent announcement that they will no longer view homosexuality as a sin. They actually do view it that way. They will allow non-celibate gay clergy, they will allow same-sex marriages, they will allow the celebrations of Pride Month, all that. But contrary to how people imagine it, one thing you've noticed about the Methodist story, they conscientiously ignored the creation of the Global Methodist Church, which broke from the United Methodist Church even before this vote. One reason this vote occurred was not simply because secular society is becoming more liberal and the church is becoming liberal to catch up to it and remain relevant. That's the narrative you keep hearing. But rather because the conservatives in the Methodist Church left and created alternatives. And now there is an alternative, and most of the conservative members have disaffiliated and joined the Global Methodist Church. And that is something else that's interesting. Our general narrative, we still follow the secularization thesis that the more advanced a society becomes, the more secular it becomes, even though that's obviously not true. And the assumption is that we see declining church attendance and declining interest in churches because traditional religious beliefs are being doubted in an age of skepticism and science and education. As people embrace secular values and scientific reason, they abandon religion. Of course, secularism is a religion. The idea that you can be secular instead of religious is silly, especially since, like atheism, they like saying it's one thing and then saying it's another, and then denying it's the second thing because of the first thing, keeping you from able to criticize it. With atheism, of course, atheism is defined as a lack of belief in a God, not a belief there is no God. Therefore, atheists make no claims and have no burden of proof. But atheists believe in science over religion. Atheists believe in scientific skepticism and critical thinking. Atheists are about reason and rationalism. Atheists believe in secular values. Atheists believe in equality for all people, yada, yada, yada. The same thing happens with secularism. Secularism is defined as simply not being religious and being independent of religion. Secularism is therefore not hostile to religion, it is simply neutrality toward religion, and has no impositional beliefs that it can impose on people. But as a society, we should embrace secular values, and if your religious values come into conflict with secular values, you must lay aside your religious values for the sake of harmony, since secularism is so much more tolerant and better. The very existence of secular values undermines the claim that secularism is neutrality toward religion, because if one's religious values can come into conflict with secular values, that makes them a rival. And as much as people today like equating religion and theism as if they're the same thing, which is why we imagine atheism to be the opposite of religion, the truth is, religion doesn't require the belief in a God. And secularism is a religion. And we really don't see, especially in 2024, people abandoning churches because of scientific skepticism, critical thinking, education, and becoming more liberal and tolerant as we embrace secular values. It seems odd that we keep pushing this narrative, though, that people are leaving churches because churches are traditional and conservative, and society is becoming more liberal and tolerant and accepting, and of course embracing critical thinking and reason. Thus, religious beliefs are not rationally supported, and besides, people today are kinder and more loving, and traditional religious beliefs oppose things like abortion, same-sex marriage, transgenderism. They don't support socialized economic policies and the like. And because these churches are inherently conservative and refuse to modernize, or at least do so very slowly, the more secular youth are abandoning religion for secularism. And we know that's not really true, because the churches that become liberal actually bleed out membership to a far greater degree than do conservative churches. We don't really see liberal churches gaining tons of members. And of course they might say, well, that's because secularism, people are abandoning religion, which is the narrative we're using. And yes, I know, I said secularism is a religion. When I say abandoning religion, I'm referring to the narrative of today, before someone accuses me of contradicting myself. But what you actually see in the real world is not people are abandoning all religion and becoming more secular, as we put it. And so it doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative. You see them abandoning liberal churches more so than conservative churches. In fact, in the last few years, you've seen a rebound and growth of interest in tradition, traditionalism, and conservative values, especially since there's a backlash against the woke. So, you don't really see the sharp decline in membership in conservative churches, and the decline you do see is slowing down, if not already reversed, depending upon which church you go to and what area. You actually see an increase in membership, an increase in interest, but only in the more conservative ones. And I'm using our world's language. Some of it doesn't really fit. For example, we generally think of traditional Catholics as conservatives. And if we make a distinction between a conservative Catholic and a traditional Catholic at all, it's that the traditional Catholics are ultra-conservative, or even more conservative and farther right-wing, and that's not an accurate assessment. But look at France even, secular France, long time secular. We have seen a great deal of interest in people returning to the traditional Latin Mass in France, of all places. Now, granted, it's not a spectacular showing, at least not yet, but it proves the point. People are not being attracted to the Novus Ordo. People are not being attracted to the United Methodist Church in large numbers. People are not being attracted to the United Churches of Christ or other more liberal churches, but they are being attracted to the more conservative ones. So it seems odd that we keep this narrative going. So what does all this have to do with my birthday? Which is the topic of this video. Well, it's the year we live in. A year of insanity, a year of great madness that sweeps the world, in which people cling to these ridiculous mythologies, or at least the kernel of them, coming up with greater and greater excuses to justify them, whilst the world spins out of control. Hollywood, for instance, must continually blame fans for being racialists and sexist and homophobic. And for some reason they think insulting the fan base as those things will cause people to watch their shows and their movies, whilst they persist in making series based upon their own ideologies, ignoring the basis that the originals that they're basing them on came from, and of course not creating anything new. We are, of course, told that it is the conservatives who don't create something new. They just hold on to the past and become rigid in tradition, whilst the liberals and secularists are coming up with new things, looking over the horizon, going on to exploration, the liberal creativity. Indeed, there was even a scientific study about a decade or so ago that said liberals were inherently more creative than conservatives, and that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that the modern liberals are less creative and cannot create worlds of their own. They simply mine the past for existing ideas, and then they just ruin them, which also seems to be what's happening in politics, because even in Europe you see people going more right-wing. Of course, the media clings to its idea that right-wing is far right-wing, and the far right-wing is fact-ist. No offense, but another euphemism. But it's very obvious at this point they can't just use that word, the F word, shall we say, and actually get people to back down anymore. Hollywood is losing money hand over fist and failing. Independent creators are emerging. And it really does seem that we are on the cusp of a great social conflagration, a collapse, possibly a revolution. Be it an actual militarized one with guns or simply a cultural revolution is irrelevant. We seem to be at a point where what was the ruling mentality, what was the ruling ideology, what was the ruling spirit of the age is dying, and a new one has come to replace it. But that new one has not settled yet. It is still wild and ill-formed, having only the broadest of concerns and beliefs and ideas, largely reacting against the excesses of its aged predecessor, but rapidly coalescing around a certain handful of issues, and soon developing more sophisticated takes upon them. It seems that we live in an era where the old order is dying, but the new one has yet to be born, and a great conflict has begun that has yet to reach its height. And again, by conflict, I don't necessarily mean a war. It could be a war, but it doesn't have to be. But I do predict, based upon history, not some sort of prophet, mind you, but I do predict that there shall be a great seismic shift in society within the next 15 or so years, and that we will see a devastating collapse of the major institutions, like the Hollywood movie machine, which was made up of the major studios, the corporate entertainment industry, that we are collectively calling Hollywood, even though a lot of the films are now made in Georgia or other places. We will see the major media outlets, which are largely merged with the entertainment concerns, collapse. People don't trust them anymore. We are going to see the political ideologies, regardless of right or left, traditionally fall apart. And we are going to begin to see people taking greater note and greater care for their words. I'm hoping this last one especially. Because remember when I told you earlier that we generally think of traditional Catholics as conservative, and if we make any difference at all, any distinction at all between a traditional Catholic and a conservative Catholic, it is that the traditional Catholic is a conservative who is ultra-conservative and more conservative than the regular conservatives, but we still put them on a left-right spectrum. There was a scandal involving Church Militant and its founder, Michael Voris, and a few news outlets that covered it referred to Michael Voris as a traditionalist Catholic. Of course, Michael Voris was not a traditionalist Catholic. He was a conservative politically, and he was a conservative in terms of modern Catholic teachings and approaches. But he attended a Novus Ordo Mass, and he was okay with the modern reforms of Vatican II. He was not a traditionalist, and yet the media called him that, because they don't make that distinction. They're very sloppy, and they don't understand the things they're reporting on. because they think they already do, much like the atheist community that I talk about often because they cause so much trouble. They think, because of their rationalist and freethinker image that they have created for themselves, that they are actually experts in philosophy and science, in history and religion. And of course, they will all tell you they've come to their own conclusions and done their own research, when all they're doing is quoting things from atheist websites and blogs and things they heard in videos. And it's one big echo chamber, since it's the same claims over and over and over again, that largely trace back to the 19th century and the Thinker's Library, released by the Rationalist Press Association. They're not really making new arguments, they're just recycling old dogmas, but they like to present themselves as experts even when what they're saying is objectively wrong. And you see that in the media as well. The media thinks it already knows, therefore it does not look into things and try and make those distinctions. And you see the same thing happening in politics, where they wish to maintain a current narrative. A narrative that has become rather cartoonish in how it's understood on both sides. The conservative side, which seems to be the one that is dominating the narrative more and more, is that the World Economic Forum and organizations like the World Health Organization are all basically run by the same handful of people, the global elites, who have a grand design to create a global governing system in which you will own nothing and you will be happy. A largely communistic authoritarian state of affairs where a handful of wealthy people continue to be wealthy and powerful. They often call this a feudalist or neo-feudalist government, even though it's not feudalist. Feudalism, by definition, would be decentralized, but people don't know what they're talking about. They imagine feudalism as wealthy lords rule and the peasants have no rights and everyone's a peasant who's not a lord. Simplistic narrative, true, but it is the narrative. And to be fair, it is not something that is sheer poppycock. It is not something that has no justification. That sort of thing is really happening. The only question is to what extent, and if the people pushing the current narrative now are correct in that extent. The left, of course, has begun to not really have a cohesive narrative. The left denies this global effort, even though they will admit it exists, which is contradictory. It's one of the reasons people are having a hard time believing the left. The difference is they pitch it not so much as a global authoritarian state as cooperation between nations and between partner groups, which will bring about a more equitable world, run by the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum and all. They are just think tanks or organizations there to help facilitate cooperation and mutual benefits and everyone prospering. They tend to downplay it as a global governing scheme and tend to frame it as cooperation, although they admit that it is a coordinated governing effort, so I'm not really sure much of a difference other than it's not authoritarian in their view. But you see this, and you realize more and more people are dissatisfied with the powers that be, and it is obvious that there's a great deal of collusion at the global governing levels. Great deal of collusion. So you don't really see a world where the people who are at the World Economic Forum, the people who are at the World Health Organization, the people who are at the G8 summits and all the other global conferences run by the wealthy are seen as trustworthy. Whether it is formally a secret shadow government or whether it really is just think tanks, it really doesn't matter because these people are cooperating with each other and it has the same effect in the long run. And ultimately, we know that certain things like the grand restart,
euphemism,
is real. Because Klaus Schwab wrote a book on it and has mentioned it several times. So there is a global plan there of some sort. But it's falling apart on them. And that's the world that I live in 2024. A world where I am a Star Trek number. A world of madness and sanity, confusion, rival narratives, declining power, nascent yet ill-formed new power, and a great conflict on the horizon. With two men being the likely candidates who matter in a presidential race, with a third man who may win, may surprise us, but likely will be kicked out. A race between a man seen as senile and a man seen as crass, and perhaps even a tyrant. A world where no matter who wins the election in those terms, no one will particularly be happy. Which is why some people are calling for the one with mental decline to step down. But we live in this world, and this is the world as it is, as I grow another year older. This is a world of opportunity. Because the entertainment industry is declining, and new creators working independently now have a shot at wider distribution simply because people are turning away from the main Hollywood system, and because we now have tools to make it easier to create films than ever before, or just writing books, they can be distributed easier. For those who are skilled enough and have enough luck, we may yet have a new, flourishing, if brief, age before a new order comes of great independent writers and a broad swath of ideas and perspectives. That is an exciting moment for creation of new things, because I myself am a writer, and I may soon release my own works under my own name for my own profit. My own creations. And even if I never complete them, or if they fail, it's still an exciting time for giving me that chance of success that I otherwise wouldn't have. For surely I could create the product, but surely in the past I would have been overshadowed by the great Hollywood system. Unless I was extraordinarily fortunate. And for all other writers out there, I will tell you, seize this day. For it is a day, and by day, of course, I mean metaphorical. I'm talking about the time period. That is rare and comes along only once in a lifetime. A time for you to carve your own name and niche in an era when all is crumbling around you of the old. You can take hold and help shape the new, or proverbially die trying. For those building back to Christianity, you can look positively at the decline of this society. Preach valiantly your message of Christ, for yours, whilst still demonized as evil, authoritarian, racist and all that, seems to have more power to attract others than does the simplistic and idiotic atheism of old, or the secularism that is shown to be collapsing, or the liberal churches. For those bold enough, you don't even have to remain in what we see as conservative Christianity. You can form an understanding that breaks free from the paradigms of the politics that have marred the faith because they are based on American politics. I am not saying that the church should never speak on political issues. I've never really believed that. I don't even believe in separation of church and state the way Americans typically do. But I do know this. In America, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans actually reflect what the church should teach, and neither do America's founding fathers. And you should preach the kingdom of Christ, not Freemasonic nonsense. And think about it. The church has gone through several revivals in the past. Each revival has brought about a new take, a new understanding of Christianity, which doesn't necessarily mean that they disagree on what is taught. But the way it is conceptualized and understood, it can be revised so more modern people can understand it. It can be brought up to date without actually changing the doctrine, like coming up with a new way of describing a concept, or a new way of accessing it. Because I don't really think the Hillsong-like singing and clapping will persevere either, because it is shallow and meaningless. But people do have a deep, deep, deep craving for that which is spiritual and true, and that love of God. And it may be rife, especially within the Protestant churches, to revise the way you understand your churches. Not to go into silly fads of things like home churches, which I don't have a problem with in theory, but I don't like the way it's handled. I don't want quiche Christianity or niche Christianity. But think. Without changing the doctrines, unless you actually think they are wrong, you can change something that lets us connect to those truths, that resonates with what people need today. For that matter, since Protestants think that churches can be in error, it may be a good time to contemplate what Christianity truly teaches, what the Bible truly says. You may find that your church is stumbling because of an error in part of your church. And I also urge this to other religions. Islam, Judaism, even Eastern religions like Buddhism. You could take the same advice I gave. Of course, modified to your own needs. Because now is a time when all is in chaos, and a new world must be born, and those bold enough to take it will shape that new world. That is my birthday in 2024. I shall take my leave now, for I have little else to say. But before I go, I would like to contemplate, as I always do on my birthday, the passage of time and the nature of time. One of the things that I have always desired is to travel through time, but, alas, yet have I done so, except in the normal way of living within the context of time. Time passes, and I wish it to pass backward, not because I remember past glory days, or because of a singular regret or series of regrets that I only wish to amend, but I have always desired to traverse time. And oh yes, I do have my regrets, and if I had my life to live over, I would do it differently. But I have always wished, even as a child, before those regrets came, wished for traversing time. And perhaps now, in this great, glorious era of change, I may be able to revisit that past, not in memory, not in the study of history, but in actuality. For we are making our strides and advances, but therein lies the great, great hope and mystery of time. For how passes it but this, and how passes time? We understand it, and yet we do not. We know it, and yet it is unknown. Time has its moods, its fluctuations,
its ways and its will, and the only master time knows is God. And therein lies the great hand to which we must ultimately appeal, for without God can nothing be. And yet here, perhaps the greatest of all forces, or perhaps itself a product of forces intermingling and commingling, fusing, is time. That thing that we would all live within, that thing whose context we need for our own existence, for we live within time, and that great venture of looking forward to what time is. I haven't much else to say, so I shall take my leave. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.